There's a specific kind of suffering that doesn't look like suffering from the outside. You're not in pain the way people expect pain to look. You're not crying every day. You're not falling apart at work. But there's someone living rent-free inside your head. And no matter what you do, you can't seem to evict them. You think about them in the morning before you're fully awake. You replay conversations. You analyze their words. You check your phone more than you'd like to admit. And the strangest part, you already know somewhere beneath all of it that this isn't entirely healthy, but knowing that doesn't make it stop. That gap between knowing and feeling is exactly what this video is about. Because what most people call being crazy about someone is actually a recognizable psychological pattern. It has a structure, it has a mechanism, and once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere. This isn't about whether the feeling is real, it is real. The question is, what's actually producing it? Let's start with the most important distinction this video will make. Addiction and love are not the same thing. They can coexist, they often do, but they operate through completely different mechanisms, and confusing the two is one of the most common psychological mistakes people make in relationships. Love, in its functional form, tends to produce something relatively stable, a sense of security, presence, the ability to think about other things. It doesn't mean the feeling is boring or flat. It means it doesn't consume you the way a craving does. Addiction, emotional addiction specifically, produces the opposite: preoccupation, urgency, a constant low-level hum of need. The feeling that you can't quite settle until you've heard from them, seen them, resolved whatever tension is sitting between you. And here's the uncomfortable part. Emotional addiction tends to feel more intense than love, not because it's deeper, but because intensity and depth are not the same thing. The neurological signature of craving is louder than the neurological signature of contentment. That's not a metaphor, it's how the brain works. Dopamine doesn't spike when things are stable. It spikes in anticipation, in uncertainty, in the moment just before resolution. So the person who keeps you guessing, who pulls you close and then creates distance, who gives you just enough to stay invested, that person produces more neurological noise than someone who is simply consistently there. More noise gets interpreted as more feeling. That's the first illusion worth dismantling. Now let's go deeper into the mechanism, because it's more precise than most people realize. The psychological pattern underlying emotional addiction in relationships has a name in behavioral science. It's called intermittent reinforcement. And while the term might sound clinical, the experience of it is anything but abstract. Intermittent reinforcement means that the reward, affection, attention, warmth, connection, doesn't arrive consistently. It arrives unpredictably. Sometimes when you reach out, you get closeness. Sometimes you get distance. Sometimes you get warmth and then silence. The ratio shifts, the pattern is irregular, and that irregularity is precisely what makes it so hard to let go. Research on reinforcement schedules, going back decades in behavioral psychology, shows consistently that unpredictable rewards produce stronger behavioral attachment than predictable ones. Slot machines are built on this principle. So, in a very real sense, are certain kinds of relationships. When you never know whether reaching out will give you warmth or distance, your nervous system stays on alert. It keeps you oriented toward the source of the uncertainty. It keeps you trying to solve the pattern. You're not weak for experiencing this. You're human. Your brain is doing exactly what brains evolved to do: persist in the face of intermittent signals, because in many environments, giving up too soon is more costly than holding on too long. The problem is that this mechanism doesn't distinguish between a food source worth pursuing and a relationship that isn't working. It just keeps you oriented. It just keeps you trying. There's another layer to this that goes beyond reinforcement schedules, and it has to do with how the self becomes involved. When you're emotionally addicted to someone, part of what you're craving isn't just them, it's resolution. It's the version of the story where things finally make sense, where you finally feel like enough, where the uncertainty collapses into clarity. This is where emotional addiction becomes entangled with identity. If someone has consistently made you feel uncertain about whether you're wanted, whether you're valued, whether you're truly seen, that uncertainty creates an unresolved psychological loop, and unresolved loops demand closure. So the preoccupation isn't always about the person, it's about what they represent. It's about the question they embody. Am I enough? Do I matter? Can I be chosen fully, not just partially? Those are old questions for most people. They didn't originate in this relationship. This relationship just reopened them. And that's one of the reasons emotional addiction is so hard to reason your way out of. You're not just dealing with attachment to a person. You're dealing with an activated wound that predates them. The person becomes a symbol, and you can't simply walk away from a symbol the way you can from a situation. If you've recognized something in what we've covered so far, that gap between knowing and feeling, that loop that won't close, it's worth sitting with. Subscribe if you want more conversations like this, and tell me in the comments what's standing out to you most. Let's talk about what this pattern does to perception, because one of its most significant effects is that it distorts how you read reality. When you're emotionally addicted to someone, your interpretive framework shifts. You start reading ambiguous signals as meaningful. Silence becomes a message. A short reply carries weight. A slight shift in tone becomes evidence of something. This isn't paranoia. It's the natural consequence of a nervous system that's been trained to look for signals in an unpredictable environment. The problem is that when you're scanning constantly, you find patterns that aren't there. You construct narratives to explain the inconsistency. You give the other person credit for depth they may not have, complexity they may not be offering, intentionality that may not exist. In short, you fill in the gaps with meaning. And the meaning you fill in tends to favor continued investment because your nervous system is oriented toward resolution, not exit. It wants to solve the pattern, not abandon it. This is why people in emotionally addictive dynamics often feel like they understand the other person deeply, when what they've actually done is construct an elaborate internal model of someone who may be far simpler or far more indifferent than the model suggests. You're not seeing them, you're seeing your interpretation of the signals they emit. That's an important distinction. There's also a physiological dimension to this that's worth naming directly. Emotional addiction activates the same neural pathways as substance craving. This isn't a loose analogy. Neuroimaging studies have shown that the experience of romantic rejection and the preoccupation that follows it produces activity in the same brain regions associated with craving and withdrawal. When you're in contact with this person, when they're warm, when things feel connected, dopamine rises. When they pull away or when contact is uncertain, dopamine drops. And that drop feels like withdrawal. Not metaphorically, neurologically. This means that the relief you feel when they finally text back, when they finally come close again, isn't just emotional, it's chemical. And chemical relief is reinforcing in a very direct way. It teaches your brain that pursuing this person reduces the discomfort of withdrawal, which means every cycle of distance and reconnection doesn't weaken the attachment, it deepens it. Every reunion feels like evidence that it's worth it. Every period of uncertainty feels like something to push through, not a signal to read. The brain learns the wrong lesson, repeatedly. Now, what happens to people who spend extended time in this pattern? One of the most consistent consequences is a gradual erosion of baseline. When you spend a long time in a state of emotional unpredictability, your nervous system recalibrates. Stability starts to feel flat. Consistency starts to feel boring. People who are genuinely available and warm start to feel somehow less real, less interesting, less charged with meaning. This is one of the most insidious effects of emotional addiction. It changes what feels like attraction. After long exposure to intermittent reinforcement, the nervous system can begin to interpret anxiety as excitement, uncertainty as chemistry, emotional turbulence as depth. Calm starts to feel like the absence of something, which means people who've been through emotionally addictive relationships often carry that recalibration into new ones. They find themselves drawn toward familiar dynamics, not because they've chosen them consciously, but because those dynamics register as intensity, and intensity has been wired to feel like connection. You're not broken if this is true for you, but you are operating with a recalibrated instrument, and a recalibrated instrument gives you inaccurate readings. There's one more element worth examining before we close, and it's perhaps the most counterintuitive. Emotional addiction doesn't always require a difficult relationship to develop. It doesn't require cruelty or dramatic conflict or obvious dysfunction. Sometimes it develops simply because of timing or circumstance, or the particular way someone entered your life at a moment when you were open or vulnerable or searching. Proximity and timing can wire attachment in ways that have nothing to do with compatibility. The brain doesn't always bond to what's right for us. It bonds to what's present, what's salient, what arrived at the right neurological moment. This matters because it means the intensity of what you feel is not always evidence of the value of what you feel. Feeling something deeply is real, but depth of feeling and quality of connection are different measurements. A feeling can be genuine and still be a product of timing, of wiring, of intermittent reinforcement, rather than a product of genuine mutual recognition. That doesn't invalidate the feeling, it just means the feeling alone isn't enough information. So let's bring this together. Emotional addiction to a person is not a character flaw. It's a recognizable psychological pattern with a clear mechanism, one that involves neurological reward systems, behavioral conditioning, identity-level unresolved questions, and the way uncertainty hijacks attention. What makes it difficult is precisely what makes it feel significant. The intensity is real, the preoccupation is real, the craving is real, but the source of that intensity isn't always what we assume it to be. It's not always depth of connection. It's not always compatibility. It's not always love in its most functional form. Sometimes it's a nervous system responding exactly as it was designed to respond, to unpredictability, to unresolved loops, to the neurological noise of intermittent reward. Understanding this doesn't make the feeling disappear, but it changes what the feeling means, and that's the shift worth making. When you understand this pattern clearly, something changes in how you read your own experience. You start to notice the difference between wanting someone and craving them, between missing a person and missing the resolution they represent, between being drawn to someone because of who they are and being drawn to them because of what they activate. You begin to see that the relationships which feel the most consuming aren't always the ones with the most substance. And the relationships that feel calm and stable aren't shallow. They're just operating through a different neurological register, one that doesn't produce as much noise, one that doesn't spike the same systems. The psychological mechanism behind emotional addiction is one of the clearest examples of how the brain can produce an experience that feels like truth, feels like evidence of something profound, while actually being a response to structure, not to meaning. Intensity is information, but it isn't the whole story. The person who consumes your thoughts may be extraordinary, or they may simply be unpredictable at the right frequency. Knowing the difference, being able to hold both possibilities at the same time, is one of the quieter forms of psychological clarity available to us. And clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, is always more useful than noise.